All right, today we're going to deconstruct a truly difficult but historically significant text, Volume 2 of Kampf. Now, to be perfectly clear, our purpose here is not to endorse or platform its contents. Instead, we're doing a purely structural analysis, taking it apart to see how the arguments are built and what kind of ideological blueprint it presents. So, let's get into it.
Just so we're all on the same page, for this entire breakdown, we are sticking only to the source material you see here. Everything we're going to talk about comes straight from the text itself. That's really the only way to understand the internal logic it's trying to build, on its own terms. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We've got 4 main parts. First up, the whole idea of a worldview versus a party. Then we'll look at the book's concept of the state. After that, we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of propaganda and organization, and we'll wrap things up with its strategy for foreign policy. All right, let's dive into part 1, worldview and party. The book kicks off with a really clear mission. It wants to hammer home that this movement is not just another political party. No, in its view, it's something totally different, something much more fundamental. So you can see the book draws a really stark line in the sand. On one side, you have what it calls typical political parties and their programs. It paints them as shallow, just chasing votes, willing to change their platform on a whim. But on the other side, it puts forward its worldview. And this is presented as something fixed, permanent, unchangeable. A core ideology that's not about winning a single election, but about completely reshaping the entire state from the ground up. And right at the core of this worldview is a term that's absolutely central to the whole thing, Völkisch, or in the original German, Völkisch. So what does the book mean by that? Well, it defines it as an ideology where race is the single most important thing for mankind. Everything else is secondary. And if you follow that logic, then the state has only one real job, to be a tool to protect and preserve these specific racial traits. It doesn't just stop at the idea, though. The book lays out a very clear, almost step-by-step plan for turning this abstract concept into reality. Step 1, you formulate the worldview. But, it argues, an idea on its own is powerless. So, step 2, you have to build a militant political movement around it. Step 3, that movement's goal is total victory. And once that's achieved, step 4 is to embed the movement's beliefs into the very foundation of the new state. Okay, so that whole idea of creating a new state leads us perfectly into our second section, the concept of the state. If the goal is to build a Völkisch state, what does that actually mean? What's its purpose? And how is it supposed to work? The text kind of walks you through 3 different ways you could view a state, and it promptly knocks down the first 2. It says a state is not just a group of people who happen to live under the same government, and it's not just an engine for making everyone wealthy. It rejects those ideas. For the author, the only correct view is the third one. The state is a vehicle, a tool, specifically to achieve political power for a single, homogeneous people. And this right here is probably one of the most critical arguments in the entire volume. The book states flatly, the state is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. It's not the destination. It's the car you use to get there. And what is that destination? The text is very, very clear about it. The end is to preserve and promote a specific race. So if that's the goal, what does this Völkisch state actually look like? Well, the book spells out the pillars, and you can see how each one logically flows from that core worldview. It rejects democracy and majority rule in favor of what it calls an aristocratic principle, rule by the best. The population is rigidly categorized. You're either a citizen, a subject, or a foreigner. The entire education system is redesigned with one goal, to hammer home a sense of race, and the state is given the job of actively promoting what it calls racial hygiene. Okay, so we have the ideology and the vision for the state, but how do you get from A to B? This brings us to section 3, which is all about the practical, real-world playbook. It's the how-to guide for building the movement and taking power. One of the first tactical points the book makes is this: speech is more effective than writing. The author is convinced that huge, world-changing movements aren't sparked by essays or pamphlets. They're sparked by powerful orators, people who can get in front of a crowd and move them emotionally. Writing, it argues, just doesn't have that same raw power. And that belief in the spoken word feeds right into the rest of the tactical toolkit. It's all about perception and control. You have to hold massive meetings, not just to spread a message, but to create a spectacle, a feeling of unstoppable momentum. Then there's the role of the SAA. the defense troops, which the book says are essential for projecting strength and crushing any opposition. And finally, the internal structure is key. You need a clear split between broad propaganda for the masses and a separate, tight-knit organization for the true believers. And at the very top of it all, one single, unquestioned leader. And this idea of a single leader isn't just about the internal structure. It applies to politics as a whole. The book absolutely despises the idea of coalitions or alliances. It argues that nothing really great in this world has ever been achieved through coalitions. The path to true power, according to this text, isn't about compromise. It's about a single movement becoming so strong that it completely vanquishes everyone else. All right, that brings us to our final section. Let's say the movement has won. It's taken control of the state. What's next? What does it want to do in the world? This is where the book lays out its grand strategy for foreign policy. When it comes to allies, the book does a sort of cold, strategic calculation. It looks at England and thinks, okay, they could be a useful partner against France. It sees Mussolini's Italy as an ideological ally, a kindred spirit, though it admits there are problems, like the dispute over South Tyrol. But then it gets to Russia, and it's a hard no. The alliance is totally rejected based on the claim that Russia is controlled by Jewish rule, which in the book's worldview makes it the ultimate enemy. So what's the point of all this? What's the endgame for this foreign policy? The text is brutally direct. The goal is to secure the existence of the race by getting more land, more soil, as it calls it. It's about creating a balance between the size of the population and the amount of territory they control. And right there, you see the direct link between the racial ideology from the beginning and a clear policy of territorial expansion. And the book lays out some very specific directives to achieve that goal. First, forget about the old pre-war colonies overseas. That's a distraction. The real focus, it says, must be a resumption of Eastern policy. In other words, expansion eastward into Europe. And it's incredibly blunt about how this will happen, not with treaties, but with the power of a triumphant sword. The strategy is clear: war. And a final tactical note: focus all your strength on a single enemy at a time. So we'll leave it with this question. When you see an ideology laid out so methodically like this, from an abstract worldview to the structure of a state to the tactics for seizing power and finally to a plan for war, what does it tell us? What does it reveal about the terrifyingly direct path that can exist between words on a page, a political blueprint, and their ultimate devastating consequences in the real world?